Hamas has thanked Canada, the UK, and France after they threatened Israel, drawing international backlash earning the praise of a terror group.
Finance Minister Francois Phillipe Champagne claims most U.S. tariffs remain, despite Prime Minister Mark Carney's order to exempt many affected products.
A week after his housing minister said real estate prices don't need to drop, Carney dodged the question, calling it, quote, not a yes or no issue. Hello Canada, it's Wednesday, May 21st, and this is the True North Daily Brief. I'm Isaac Lamoureux.
And I'm Geoff Knight.
We've got you covered with all the news you need to know. Let's discuss the top stories of the day and the True North exclusives you won't hear anywhere else. After the leaders of Canada, the UK, and France sent out a joint statement condemning Israel and threatening, quote, concrete action if it doesn't stop military operations in Gaza, the globally recognized terrorist entity Hamas publicly expressed its gratitude to the Western leaders. Hamas released an official statement thanking Prime Ministers Mark Carney, Keir Starmer, and President Emmanuel Macron for their joint statement of condemnation against Israel on Monday, marking the second time Hamas has publicly thanked Canada. The statement comes after Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Israel plans on, quote, taking control of all of Gaza on Monday and to open a humanitarian supply of food into Gaza from its borders. Hamas said it, quote, welcomed the joint statement and called it a significant step in the right direction. The terrorist group said the declaration reflects a, quote, principled stance against the Israeli occupation and Zionist plans of genocide and forced displacement. It said the statement from the world leaders was, quote, an important step towards restoring the principles of international law, which it said have been systematically undermined by the terrorist government of Netanyahu. Carney released a statement Monday saying the leaders, quote, strongly oppose the expansion of Israel's military operations in Gaza and that Israel stating it would allow a basic quantity of food into Gaza is wholly inadequate. The leaders also called on Hamas to release hostages it has held since October 7th, 2023. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu released his own statement condemning the joint declaration by Canada, the UK, and France. It said, the leaders are offering a huge prize to Hamas for its, quote, genocidal attack on October 7th. So, Geoff, is Carney treading a similar path to that of his predecessor, former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, when it comes to foreign policy in the Middle East?
Mark Carney's approach to Middle Eastern foreign policy diverges significantly from Justin Trudeau's more balanced stance during his tenure. Trudeau's government, while critical of Israel at times, often sought a middle ground, condemning Hamas's actions while supporting Israel's right to self-defense. For instance, Trudeau's administration voted against UN resolutions condemning Israel's violations of Palestinian rights until 2019, when it began supporting them, and welcomed in the 2020 Abraham Accords as a positive step towards Middle Eastern peace. Trudeau also convened the Incident Response Group in 2023 to address Hamas's attacks on Israel, unequivocally condemning the group while expressing concern for civilian lives on both sides. Carney, however, appears to be taking a more assertive stance against Israel, aligning with progressive international voices but risking criticism for tilting too far. His statement with Starmer and Macron not only strongly opposes Israel's operations, but threatens concrete action, which is a sharper tone than Trudeau's typically adopted. While Carney also called for Hamas to release hostages taken on October 7th, the statement's focus on Israel's actions and Hamas's subsequent gratitude suggests a shift towards a more critical view of Israel, potentially at the expense of the balanced diplomacy Trudeau pursued. Carney's approach seems to prioritize international law and humanitarian concerns. Finance Minister Francois Phillipe Champagne insists that the federal government has retained the bulk of its retaliatory tariffs against the U.S. despite an order by Prime Minister Mark Carney to exempt a large swath of impacted products. While the tariffs are still technically in place, Oxford Economics revealed that the carve-outs announced by Prime Minister Mark Carney effectively nullified most of the levies Canada had imposed on trade with America. Canada hit the U.S. with several retaliatory tariffs in March, implementing 25% across-the-board tariffs with a further round of tariffs levied in April. The first suite of tariffs involved new import taxes of 25% on about $60 billion in U.S. goods before adding additional levies against American vehicles in early April. Despite previously pledging to support maximum impact trade measures, Carney decided with his cabinet to exempt certain goods while still on the campaign trail. Carney's exemptions cancel out nearly all of the retaliatory tariffs that both he and former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau had introduced in response to the Trump administration. Champagne said that 70% of the counter tariffs implemented in March currently remain in place after Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre shared Oxford's findings. The tariff exemptions mark a stark contrast from Carney's heavily pushed elbows up message while on the federal election campaign trail, which was well received by many Canadians. Champagne quietly implemented a 6-month tariff exemption during the middle of the campaign on April 15th, with the Government of Canada only officially publishing the announcement on May 7th, more than a week after the federal election concluded. The exemptions included products used in Canadian manufacturing, processing, and food and beverage packaging. Automakers such as General Motors were also permitted to import select vehicles into Canada without being tariffed. Isaac, were there any other interesting findings that Oxford Economics pointed out in their report?
Yeah, Geoff, obviously, the most important thing raised and highlighted in the report was that retaliatory tariffs were more of a slogan and a mirage than a tangible substance that Carney quickly and quietly removed. However, many retaliatory tariffs remain on food, which have been negatively affected by counter tariffs, an issue explained in depth online by Dr. Sylvain Charbois, aka the food professor. Food inflation rose at a greater rate than any other industry. In fact, overall inflation in Canada rose more slowly in April than it did in March, thanks to the consumer carbon tax being lowered to $0. However, food prices saw a 3.8% annual increase in April, and prices for food have increased ahead of the rest of the consumer price index for the past 3 months. And meanwhile, food inflation has cooled in the United States while it has skyrocketed in Canada. The food professor said, quote, "The root causes are increasingly evident. Ottawa's earlier decision to implement counter tariffs disrupted long-standing North American procurement systems. In response, Canadian grocers began pivoting away from U.S. suppliers, particularly in categories like fresh produce and frozen foods, and turned to costlier or less efficient alternatives. The results are now showing up on the grocery bill." Taking it back to Oxford Economics, though, they predict that the Canadian economy will enter a recession this year, while predicting that inflation will actually rise to 3% in 2026, despite the consumer carbon tax's removal lessening the blow for now. A week after Canada's new housing minister said housing prices don't need to go down, Prime Minister Mark Carney said it isn't a yes or no question when pressed on his own position on the cost of housing. Despite his recent appointment as housing minister under Carney, Gregor Robertson stated last week that lowering housing prices was not his goal. When questioned about lowering housing prices, Minister Robertson disagreed with that idea. He emphasized that his main goal was to increase the number of homes available and stabilize the market. At the same time, Robertson said his government would make housing more affordable. Asked in Rome during a media event at Pope Leo XIV's inaugural Mass whether housing prices should decrease, Carney evaded the question, saying that it's not a simple yes or no issue. He explained that the answer depends on the time frame and the specific type of housing. Carney said his government's priority is to make housing more affordable rather than solely bringing costs down. He vowed several policies to lower prices, including some borrowed from the Conservative platform during the election. So, Geoff, how do most Canadians view housing prices, and what do recent polls on the issue say?
Most Canadians view housing prices with significant concern, seeing them as a major barrier to affordability and home ownership. A 2024 survey by Habitat for Humanity Canada revealed that 70% of Canadians believe owning a home has become impossible, with Gen Z particularly worried, 73% expressing anxiety about saving enough for a down payment. The survey also found that 78% think the inability to own a home is widening the wealth gap, and 82% say the lack of affordable housing is shrinking the middle class, reflecting widespread frustration with high housing costs across demographics. Recent polls further underscore this sentiment. A Leger poll from August 2024 showed that 67% of Canadians feel housing prices are too high, with 45% specifically calling for government action to bring prices down, rather than just increasing supply or stabilizing the market, as Gregor Robertson emphasized. Additionally, a Wahi survey from earlier this year indicated that 61% of Canadians prefer single-family homes with backyards, which are often the most expensive and least available, adding a pressure on prices. These polls highlight a clear public demand for lower housing costs, contrasting with Carney's nuanced, not a yes or no stance, and Robertson's focus on supply over price reduction. suggesting a disconnect between the government's approach and Canadians' expectations.
That's it for today, folks. Thanks for tuning in. You can stay on top of new episodes every weekday by subscribing to the Daily Brief on iTunes and Spotify. Also, while you're at it, make sure to hit us with a 5-star rating and please leave a review.